Okay, so imagine this. You're the son of a king, like the sun, right? But there's a secret, a big secret. It's that you're illegitimate. And, well, that was the reality for James, Duke of Monmouth.
Hmm.
And today we're going to be talking all about him. We're diving deep into his story as told by the Noble Blood podcast.
Well, Monmouth's life is like a textbook example of ambition, loyalty,
Right.
and just how fickle fate can be. I mean, his story still resonates with people even today, centuries later. It's a reminder that power, it can be a blessing and a curse.
Definitely. And one thing that I found really interesting about Monmouth's story was that before he even met his father, the king,
Right.
he was actually imprisoned in the Tower of London as a child.
Oh, yeah. That's a detail that often gets kind of overlooked.
Yeah.
But it's really important to understand why that happened. We got to step back in time to 17th century England.
Okay.
The country was still kind of recovering from the English Civil War, and Charles II, Monmouth's father, had just returned from exile to reclaim the throne.
So you're saying that he's this young boy, right? Caught in the middle of all this upheaval.
Absolutely.
That sounds like a recipe for a pretty complex relationship with his father.
Absolutely. Charles clearly adored Monmouth. He showered him with titles, brought him into the royal court,
Yeah.
but he never publicly acknowledged him as his heir.
Hmm.
And the idea of legitimizing him was never really on the table.
So that must have been such a strange dynamic for Monmouth. To feel loved, but also constantly reminded that he was illegitimate.
Oh, for sure. I mean, just imagine the inner turmoil, being publicly adored by the king, yet constantly aware that people are whispering and doubting his legitimacy.
Right.
It probably created this deep need for validation, like he had to prove himself worthy.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. And then on top of all that, you had the religious tension of the time.
Right.
England was deeply divided between Protestants and Catholics.
Oh, absolutely.
And Monmouth, as a Protestant,
Yes.
he became a symbol of hope for people who were opposed to the king's Catholic brother, James, Duke of York.
Yeah, religion played a huge role in shaping public perception of Monmouth. I mean, he was charismatic,
Yeah.
he was a successful soldier, and crucially, he was Protestant. People started to see him as a real alternative to James, and that's when the rumors about his legitimacy really started to swirl.
It's like they were looking for any reason to support him.
Exactly.
Like there's even that story about Monmouth demonstrating the king's touch.
Oh, right.
Supposedly healing a woman with scrofula. It seems like people were just grasping at any evidence to support his claim to the throne.
Well, that story just highlights how powerful propaganda and belief can be.
Hmm.
It wasn't just Monmouth himself pushing that narrative. His supporters actively promoted his claim. They would twist even the smallest events into proof of his legitimacy.
It's wild how much influence that kind of thing can have, but this growing popularity, fueled by religious tension and whispers of legitimacy, it also had some dangerous consequences.
Right.
It led to the Rye House plot,
Yeah.
the conspiracy to assassinate King Charles and put Monmouth on the throne.
The Rye House plot was a major turning point for Monmouth. It showed just how volatile the political atmosphere was and how much of a threat he posed, even if it was unintentional.
Yeah, because even though King Charles seemed to believe that Monmouth wasn't directly involved in the plot, it definitely damaged their relationship. And then, to make matters worse, the king dies.
Right.
Which leaves Monmouth in a really precarious position.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now he's got his Catholic uncle, James II, as the new king. He's at a crossroads.
Yeah.
Does he accept his fate under James's rule, or does he take a gamble and fight for the throne himself? I mean, talk about a tough decision, right? Submit to his Catholic uncle when the country is so divided religiously, or risk everything for the crown.
And he chooses rebellion.
He does.
Why? What pushed him to that?
Well, it was probably a bit of everything. Grief over his father's death, ambition, and people around him telling him he could do it. Monmouth was surrounded by people who really believed he was their best shot at a Protestant ruler.
He was vulnerable.
Yes, very. He was grieving. And maybe he let himself believe it was his destiny.
So he starts the Monmouth Rebellion.
Yeah.
But from what I remember from the Noble Blood episode, this rebellion was doomed from the get-go.
Pretty much, yeah. It was poorly planned. They didn't have the resources or the organization to go up against the royal army.
Right.
Monmouth's forces were mostly just common people, farmers, artisans. They were enthusiastic, but they just weren't trained soldiers.
Like a bunch of idealists going up against a wall.
Exactly. And that's what the Battle of Sedgemoor really showed. Monmouth's forces just couldn't compete. The royal army was led by John Churchill,
who later became the Duke of Marlborough, right?
That's right. And he was a brilliant military leader. The Royal Army was just a well-oiled machine compared to Monmouth forces. It was a huge defeat for Monmouth and the beginning of the end for him.
And the Noble Blood episode mentioned he was captured hiding in a ditch disguised as a shepherd.
Yeah.
What a fall from grace.
It really is. From Duke of Monmouth with all the privileges in the world to hiding in a ditch trying to escape. Shows how quickly things can change.
Especially when you're playing the game of power.
For sure. But, even when he was captured and facing death, he still tried to beg his uncle, King James II, for mercy.
He was desperate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He wrote letters begging for his life, saying he'd do anything.
Anything to avoid execution.
Exactly. I mean, you can understand why he lived a life of luxury and privilege. To face such a brutal end must have been terrifying.
I can only imagine.
But for James II, pardoning Monmouth would have looked weak. It could have undermined his authority and maybe even sparked more unrest. And don't forget, treason was a huge deal back then.
Yeah, you didn't mess around with treason.
No, you didn't.
So despite all his pleas, he was sentenced to death.
Yeah.
And not just any death, but beheading.
That's right. Beheading was seen as a more honorable death reserved for nobles. In a way, it was James II acknowledging Monmouth's status, even though he refused to accept his claim to the throne.
But even in death, it sounds like things didn't go smoothly for him.
No, not at all. The Noble Blood episode described the execution as a bit of a mess.
What happened?
Well, the executioner, Jack Ketch, he was notorious for being incompetent. And according to some accounts, it took him several blows to finally sever Monmouth's head.
Ugh, that's awful. Imagine witnessing that.
It must have been a truly horrific sight. What a way to end a life that had so much promise. Born into illegitimacy, raised in luxury, only to lose everything in a risky bid for power that he never really had a chance of winning.
Like a Shakespearean tragedy.
Exactly. Monmouth's story shows us that even those born close to power can be seduced by it and ultimately destroyed by it. He was a pawn in a much larger game caught between religious fanaticism, political ambition, and his own undeniable charm.
And even after his death, the rumors about his legitimacy didn't just disappear.
No, they persisted for years. Even though they were never proven true, those rumors show how fascinated people were with Monmouth's life and all the what-ifs that surround it. Yeah, all those what-ifs. What if he'd been legitimate? What if the rebellion had worked?
Makes you think, how different things could be if just one tiny thing had changed.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's like those sliding doors moments in history. One choice leads to another and suddenly everything's different.
You mentioned before the history is written by the victors. How do you think that applies to Monmouth?
Well, think about it. We mostly see him as a failure, right? Driven by ambition, meets a bad end. But there's more to it. He was also a product of his times, caught in all these religious and political tensions that were way bigger than him.
So for someone listening to us today, why should they care about some duke from ages ago? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that even though the world was different back then, some things never change. Like the desire for power, the impact of propaganda, how charisma and ambition can be good or bad. Those are all things we still deal with today.
When I was listening to the Noble Blood episode, I really got caught up in all the drama and excitement.
Oh yeah, it's a great story.
But it's easy to forget that behind all the titles and battles, there's a real person there.
Absolutely. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not just dates and facts. It's about people making choices, having relationships, experiencing victories and defeats. Monmouth's life, even though it ended tragically, reminds us that history is about us. It's about being human.
Well, we've really explored a lot today about the Duke of Monmouth. Any last thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Just keep exploring, learn more about this period of history, see things from different angles, and decide for yourself what you think about the Duke of Monmouth and his role in history.
And of course, if you enjoyed our deep dive, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more journeys into the world of knowledge. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.